Is there anything worse than being caught in one of your opponent's favourite lines of the Sicilian after e4, c5? Yet many of the moves which avoid the main lines, such as c3, d3 or knight c3, are really too quiet for the taste of true 1e4 players. On this video, I'm going to show you some new and deadly weapons as white, which will snatch the psychological initiative from under black's nose and put him in positions in which you can butcher him in short order. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Most Sicilian players tend to want to stick to their pet line no matter what, so you can expect a dragon player to go 2d6 followed by knight f6 and g6, and a Najdorf player to go a6. This tends to work very well when white plays the main lines with knight f3 and on his next move d4. But in my experience, you can cause no end of confusion by delaying or even omitting d4 altogether and instead nonchalantly bring your knight out to c3. Now if after white's move knight f3, black plays his knight out to c6, and then white of course plays knight c3, black may try to go for some kind of Sveshnikov or classical variation by bringing his knight out to f6, just hoping that white plays d4. The obvious move for white in this position is in fact not d4 at all, but e5, attacking the knight on f6. But for many years, the theoreticians have assumed that this was very bad because of knight g4, attacking this e5 pawn, and if white defends it with queen e2, then black attacks it once again with the move queen c7. However, it does now seem that white's tactical chances have been completely underestimated. A number of white players have played knight b5 in this position, which has got the idea, after queen b8, of going d4. And now if black attacks this knight on b5 with a6, the knight doesn't retreat at all, but it advances into black's guts with knight d6 check. After e takes d6, white will continue with e takes d6 check, and after king d8, white goes d takes c5, with a very strong attack for the sacrifice piece because black's king is caught in the centre and his pieces are really badly placed, especially this bishop on c8 and queen on b8. So after this knight b5, queen b8, d4, black shouldn't play a6 at all, but instead should calmly play c takes d4, which I guarantee that most people, when first playing against this line, wouldn't even consider because of the dangerous looking bishop out to f4. Amazingly, I think this position is still very playable for black. I think he can play the move f6, which looks incredibly greedy, but white can't take this pawn on f6 because of queen takes f4. White has tried various attacking moves in this position, and he seems to get quite good compensation for his pawn after either castles queenside, or simply dropping the bishop back to g3, whereupon knight g takes e5 can be met by knight f takes d4. Black is seriously behind in development in this position, but there again he is a solid pawn up. So I personally had my doubts about whether white's got quite enough for his pawn. For this reason, I'm going to recommend a different sixth move for white. Instead of knight b5, I think that knight d5 is actually a better move. And now after black goes queen back to b8, white still plays d4. The point of this move is that if black now plays c takes d4, white covers the pawn on e5 with bishop out to f4. Now the fact that the bishop on f4 is now protected by the knight on d5 is really crucial because black obviously can't play f6 because of e takes f6 when the bishop's covered. In order to stop e6, black should therefore play e6 himself. And now white attacks this knight on g4 with the move h3. If black now plays e takes d5, then white lops off this knight on g4, and in this final position he's got a tremendous attacking game, because this rook on h1 is already activated and white's ready to go castles queenside, recover this pawn on d4 and then attack. Instead of capturing this knight on d5, black should really retreat his own knight back to h6. But then white lops off the knight on h6, bishop takes h6, and if black goes gh, there's this massive check on f6, which would displace black's king and leave him in a terrible state. So black should now take this knight on d5 with e takes d5. But even then he's not out of the woods, because white can drop his bishop back to f4, and what he intends to do is castle queenside and then take this d4 pawn off. Black really has to stop this from happening. So before white castles queenside, he should throw in this bishop b4 check. White ought to parry this by dropping his bishop back to d2, and after bishop takes d2 check, he should take with his queen. Black can temporarily go 2 pawns up in this position with knight takes e5, but even so the position is rather worse for him. White can play knight takes d4, and in the not too distant future he's not only going to take this pawn on d5 as well, but eventually have pressure against black's isolated pawn on d7. In my opinion, white's got a nice clear advantage in a position that's very easy to play and very difficult for black to conduct. I'm fairly sure that most black players will take fright at the thought of this bishop coming out to f4, and instead hurry to try and fend off white's active pieces with the move e6. This was in fact played in a game between Onoprenko and Rinderman, played in the Czech Republic in 1993, and Onoprenko played h3, after which black surprised his opponent by playing knight on g4 takes e5. Now in this position, I think that white made a mistake. He played d takes e5. What he should do is play instead knight takes e5. Now the first point of this move is that if black now plays knight takes e5, then white develops his bishop out to f4, pinning the knight on e5 against the queen on b8, and if black plays e takes d5, then bishop takes e5 actually wins black's queen, because d6, for example, is met by bishop takes d6, uncovering a check from white's queen on e2. I hardly think that this is what black was hoping for when he played 1c5. White might have rejected the move knight takes e5 because of the counterblow knight takes d4, hitting white's queen with both of his knights on d5 and e5 loose at the same time. What he probably missed was that he can now play his queen out to h5, hitting this pawn on f7. And if black fends this threat off with g6, you can go knight f6 check, and after king e7, play the queen to g5. If black hunts this rook on a1 with knight takes c2 check, and after king d1, knight takes a1, he'll surely succumb to a quick mate, say with knight e4 check, king e8, and now queen f6, once again threatening this pawn on f7 and introducing ideas like bishop out to g5, threatening queen d8 mate. Because of the dangers black faces when trying to win this pawn on e5 with queen c7, a lot of blacks have tried instead to complete their development or eliminate the e5 pawn in some other way, And the moves that come into this category are d6, g6 and f6. Unfortunately for black, none of them are especially good. After this f6 move, white should simply capture it with ef, and then after black recaptures with knight takes f6, he can lash out with d4. Black really should take this pawn before it does any damage with c takes d4, and then white goes knight out to b5, not only threatening to recapture the pawn, but also a sneaky mate with knight d6 mate. Most black players will probably spot this threat and defend against it with e6. But then of course white can calmly recover his pawn with knight b takes d4 and emerge with a superior pawn structure. The point is that black has got 3 pawn islands in this position, a7 and b7, d7 and e6, g7 and h7, against white's 2 pawn islands, a2, b2 and c2, f2, g2 and h2. Amongst professional players, this is known to constitute a serious advantage. g6 is quite a logical idea, in order to bring the bishop to g7 and attack the pawn on e5. But unfortunately for black, there's a drawback. At the moment, there's no pressure on this e5 pawn, so white can take a time out to drive the knight from g4 with h3. And after this knight drops back to the h6 square, white can shut it out of play for a considerable length of time by going g4. In this position, the knight on h6 really doesn't have very much of a future, because if black plays bishop g7 followed by castles, which presumably is his idea, the knight here has got no squares whatsoever. The best of black's 5th move alternatives is probably d6, and after e takes d6, black should play the move e6. However, in this case, white will gain the 2 bishops by going knight b5, threatening knight c7 check, and really forcing black to go bishop takes d6, after which knight takes d6 check accomplishes white's mission. In one game between Josliani and Arakamia played in Belgrade 1992, black, after e takes d6, replied with the apparently natural move queen takes d6. But unfortunately for black, this exposes the queen too much, far too early in the game. White replied very energetically with d4, smashing open the game with black behind in development. And after c takes d4, there followed knight b5, the queen dropped back to d8, and now bishop out to f4 threatened knight c7 check, and really forced black to play e5. White continued her lightning quick development with castle's queenside, after which black struggled to catch up with bishop c5, and after white attacked this knight on g4 with h3, she castled kingside, trying to get the king to safety. Unfortunately, this kingside did not prove to be a safe haven, as after h takes g4, e takes f4, white played queen e4, suddenly converging on this h7 square with a rook on h1 and queen on e4 of course. Black replied with h6, only to run into the undermining move g5. She tried to play bishop g4, but then bishop d3 threatened a deadly check with queen h7. In desperation, black made room for her king with rook e8, but even so, queen h7 check, king f8, g takes h6 gave white a ferocious attack, and black had to resign in just a few more moves. After knight f3, knight c6, knight c3. A lot of players who prefer the dragon setup with black will probably go g6 at this moment, hoping to get their favourite line in should white play d4. At this point, however, I recommend that you suddenly throw your h-pawn down the board with h4. The idea behind this move is of course to play h5, after which this h-pawn will be a thorn in black's side. Black may choose to ignore this threat by going bishop g7, but then h5 would really give black some quite serious problems. He can't, for example, easily play his knight out to f6, because then h6 would force this bishop into the humiliating retreat bishop back to f8. It's far more likely that black will try and defend against this h5 threat by developing his knight out to f6. But then, once again, you can stun him with the move e5. At first glance this doesn't seem to make any sense at all, because now black can play knight g4, and if you go queen e2 for example, he can go bishop g7 and just pick off this e5 pawn. However, this is not white's idea at all. White should play the move h5. The point of this being that if black now captures the e5 pawn with knight g takes e5, then white plays knight takes e5, and after black recaptures knight takes e5, he can hit the knight with f4. This knight would of course be forced to retreat to c6, but then h takes g6 forces fg, and now bishop out to d3 creates this threat of bishop takes g6 check, which is very difficult indeed for black to meet. If black attempts to defend himself with bishop g7, defending this rook on h8, then the lightning strikes from a slightly different direction with rook takes h7. The point of which is that rook takes h7 loses several pawns for black after bishop takes g6 check, followed on the next move by bishop takes h7. Instead of immediately capturing this e5 pawn, black should probably build up with bishop g7. But then white has an intriguing possibility which I think puts black in serious trouble, and that is the move knight on f3 to g5, when white's queen on d1 hits the knight on g4. Black's natural reply is knight g4 takes e5. And then if white plays f4 too early, I don't think the position's very clear after f6. Instead of this, I think white should first of all play h takes g6. And then if black plays hg in reply, white can go rook takes h8 check, and after bishop takes h8, only now play f4. This knight on e5 is trapped, so black has to go f6. But then white can drop the knight on g5 back to e4, and after black's knight on e5 retreats to f7, white can play queen g4, hitting this pawn on g6. Black can try and win a piece in two different ways in this position. The first is with f5, but unfortunately for him, this runs into queen takes g6, and if he greedily takes this knight on e4, there's the move queen g8 mate. A slightly better line for black is to go d5, but even so this is hardly attractive after queen takes g6, d takes e4, and now white wins back his piece with queen g8 check, king d7 which is forced, and now queen takes f7. And not only is white level on material, but black's king on d7 can hardly be described as being safe. If black can't safely play knight g takes e5, the question arises as to what he can play. If he defends this knight on g4 with the move d6 for example, then white plays the extremely painful reply e6, threatening this pawn on f7 and also renewing the attack on the knight on g4 with the queen on d1. If black retreats this knight on g4 to h6, then white can support the e5 pawn with simply f4, after which black's position looks very unpleasant. Not only is this knight on h6 very badly placed indeed, but white has got strong pressure on the h-file. Going back to the position after knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, one of black's more solid options is to go d6. In this case, white can give the game an independent turn by playing his bishop out to b5, which has got the cunning idea that after bishop d7, you take this knight off, bishop takes c6, and after bishop takes c6, continue lightning fast development with d4. C takes d4, and now capture with the queen, which brings the pieces out very fast indeed and prepares to castle queenside after developing this bishop on c1, say out at g5. Black's normal move after queen takes d4 is to play knight out to f6, and after bishop g5 he goes e6. White can now hoist the pirate flag with castles queenside, and then black usually goes bishop e7. When this position was first played with white, he did all kinds of moves like king b1, rook he1, but none of these proved especially effective. Recently, however, a talented young Armenian player called Sergei Movzizian has been championing the move queen d3, which has got the idea of moving this knight from f3 to d4 and then throwing the kingside pawns forward with f4, perhaps h4 and even g4. The idea of this bold advance is not only a simple kingside pawn storm to open lines on that sector of the board, but also to attack this e6 square in many lines with the move f5. In one of Movzizian's games, played in Slovakia in 1995, his opponent, Banas, played the aggressive move queen out to a5. Movzizian played the wise precautionary move, king b1, whereupon his opponent castled kingside. Before playing his knight to d4, it's necessary first of all to protect this bishop on g5, so Movzizian now played h4, and after rook a to c8, he brought his knight on f3 to d4. Black brought his other rook into action with rook f to d8, and now Movzizian advanced more kingside pawns with f4. Black played a6, preparing his traditional counterplay, but unfortunately for him, it was rather too slow. White played f5, attacking this e6 pawn, and now black had to make a concession with e5, which gives white the d5 square. White played bishop takes f6, removing one of the defenders of d5. Black recaptured with bishop takes f6, and now white dropped his knight on d4 back to e2. This position proved to be rather bad for black. Not only did white have control over the d5 square, on which he later put a knight, but he also was able to advance his kingside pawns with g4 and g5. Instead of playing bishop d7, black might consider some other options, but he has to be very, very careful at this moment. If, for example, he develops his knight out to f6, which looks like a very natural move, then white can hit him with e5, and after de, knight takes e5, black is unable to avoid getting very weak doubled c-pawns after, say, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, and now bc would leave black's pawn structure in a terrible state. The attempt to set up a dragon formation with g6 once again runs into trouble but this time because of the move d4. If black now goes c takes d4, then white captures on d4 with his queen, hitting this rook on at h8. Black can of course defend against this by bringing his knight out to f6, but then white continues his attack with e5. In this position black is already close to lost, because if he goes d takes e5, white can play queen takes d8 check, and after king takes d8, go bishop takes c6, bc, and now knight takes e5, hitting both the pawn on c6 and the one on f7. One of black's most solid replies may be to stabilise the centre by going e5. But then white gets a small advantage due to his control of the d5 square. One game between Joel Benjamin and Max DeLugie in the New York Open in 1987 continued quietly with d3, and after DeLugie's bishop e7, Benjamin went about winning the bishop pair with knight d5, and after black played knight f6, he went c3 and met castles with knight takes e7 check. White must be better in this position because of his long-term advantage of the two bishops. After white's knight c3, black can also play this stabilising e5 move immediately, but then white doesn't need to bring his bishop out to b5, but can instead put it on the c4 square, from where it bears down on this d5 weakness. Black's natural move now is just d6, after which white should play d3. Now if black's not very careful, he can get into big trouble here. For example, if he plays his knight out to f6, then suddenly he faces knight g5, with an unstoppable threat to take on f7. Most blacks will probably spot this and play their bishop out to e7. But now white can play his knight into d5, and after knight out to f6, gain the bishop pair with knight takes e7. If black on his fifth move pins this knight on f3 with bishop out to g4, he has to be very careful indeed when white goes h3. The point is that if black now drops his bishop back with bishop h5, white can play knight takes e5, sacrificing his queen, and after bishop takes d1, there is bishop takes f7 check, king e7, and now knight d5 mate. When I played knight c3 in one of my games against the Soviet GM Razovayev, he played e6 against me, after which I brought my bishop out to b5, threatening to give black doubled pawns with bishop takes c6. Razovayev decided to stop this by moving his knight, and he played knight out to d4, whereupon I continued in white's nonchalant style with castles kingside. If black now takes off this bishop with knight takes b5, white of course recaptures with knight takes b5, and now black is in great danger of falling too far behind in development. So far he's got no pieces out whatsoever. One game between Yudashin and Filipov from St. Petersburg 1996 continued with a6, knight c3, and now black still didn't develop any pieces. He went b5, whereupon white took space in the centre with d4. Black took this pawn off with cd, and then Yudashin took on d4 with his queen, after which black's got trouble developing this bishop on f8 because of the pressure against g7. After bishop b7, white played bishop g5, and now black saw nothing better than to weaken himself with f6. Yudashin dropped the bishop back to h4, and after rook c8, he played a3, stopping any ideas of b4 for example, and on bishop c5, queen d3, knight e7, he set up strong pressure on the d-file with rook a d1, which in fact stops black castling kingside. With black's king stuck in the centre and white having this serious d-file pressure, I wouldn't like to be black at all. Instead of capturing this bishop on b5, Rozovayev therefore continued his development with knight e7. And now I took the knight on d4, with knight takes d4, and black of course recaptured. I dropped my knight back to e2. Rozovayev brought his queen out to b6, and now I defended the bishop on b5 with the move a4. When Rozovayev hit this bishop on b5 with a6, I dropped it back to d3, and when he brought his knight from e7 to c6, I played c3, aiming to eliminate this pawn on d4. Rozovayev captured on c3 with dc, and I took back with the d pawn, which aims at quick development. Rozovayev also continued to develop by bringing his bishop to e7, but then I built up on the king side with bishop c2. After he castled, played the move queen d3, with latent threats against the h7 square. In this game I managed to build up a strong attack and won in 39 moves, and it was in fact one of the games which brought me my final GM norm. Instead of moving this knight on c6 with knight d4, black can also protect it with knight g e7. White should then continue his theme of fast development with castles, and now black usually attacks this bishop on b5 with a6. White of course doesn't lose time retreating, but simply captures on c6, and black recaptures with his knight. In order to capitalise on his leading development, white has to open the game up, and this he does with d4. Black must take with c takes d4, and then knight takes d4 leaves black with a difficult decision to make. If black continues his kingside development with bishop e7, white can capture on c6 with knight takes c6, and after bc, seal this weakness on d6 with a move e5. After black castles kingside, white continues to build up on the d6 square by going knight to e4, and now if black tries to lash out by going f6 in order to break this stranglehold, white takes on f6 with ef, and after bishop takes f6, he can play his queen into d6, with quite a stranglehold on the game. Black can prevent this e5 idea by going d6, but then after rook e1, he gets into trouble if he develops his kingside with bishop e7. The point is that white can now play knight takes c6, and after bc, go queen out to g4, hitting this pawn on g7. If black defends it by castling kingside, white unleashes bishop h6, and after bishop f6, to protect the g7 pawn, white can go e5. The first point of this move is that if black plays bishop takes e5, white sacrifices the exchange with rook takes e5, and thus threatens mate on g7. The second point is that if black takes on e5 with a pawn, de, white can go knight to e4, putting pressure on this bishop on f6. When black goes queen e7, white can do rook on a1 to d1, and if black tries to escape this pin on his g7 pawn with king h8, white drops his bishop back to e3 and threatens bishop c5. I think you'll agree that this is a really ugly position for black. He's got almost no moves whatsoever. Rather than play bishop to e7, black normally prefers bishop to d7 But then white can once again give black serious problems with his development by going knight takes c6, and after b takes c6, bring his queen out to the g4 square, from where it pins this bishop to f8 because of the need to defend the pawn on g7. In a game between Miles and Chandler, played in Surakarta in Indonesia in 1982, Chandler replied to this knight takes c6 move with bishop takes c6, but nevertheless had serious problems after Miles's queen g4. Eventually he decided to go g6, but was then stunned with the move knight into d5, which of course can't be captured because of a discovered check from the rook on e1. Chandler desperately tried to block the e-file with bishop e7, but then Miles unleashed bishop out to h6, stopping black from castling kingside. The point of this move is that if black now captures the knight on d5 with ed, white replies with ed, and if black now goes bishop takes d5, there's the move queen d4, forking the rook on h8 and the bishop on d5. The fact that black played rook g8 in this position showed just how bad his position had become. Miles continued to build up with rook a d1 and went on to win in just 31 moves. Instead of the immediate d6, black has also played queen c7, and after rook e1, only then moved his d-pawn one square forward. In a game between Yudashin, playing white against Odachovsky in Calgary 1996, Yudashin captured this knight on c6, and after bc, didn't play the immediate queen g4. Instead of this, white played the cunning move b3, the point of which is that if black goes g6 now, white can go bishop b2 and meet bishop g7 with knight d5, attacking the queen on c7, and when black captures this knight, white takes the bishop on g7. Black actually played bishop e7, but then white switched back to his original plan with queen out to g4. Black defended this pawn on g7 with bishop f6, but then ran into the move e5. If black now plays de, then as usual knight e4 will follow, and this time white has a deadly new possibility with his queen's bishop, that of going bishop out to a3. Black therefore captured on e5 with his bishop, but this time ran into the exchange sacrifice rook takes e5. The point of this is that if black takes with de, white eats this pawn on g7 with queen takes g7, and after rook f8 he can choose between either bishop h6 or bishop a3 and meet c5 with knight e4. There's really nothing black can do about this threat of bishop takes c5, with the rook on f8 hanging immediately afterwards. Black can also reach this line via a different move order, and that's by playing e6 on his second move without these knights on c6 and c3. After white's knight c3, the reply knight c6 leads to positions we've just looked at, but instead of this move we're going to consider other black options such as a6, d6 and knight out to f6. This latter move actually transposes into a Nimzowitsch variation after e5, knight d5 and now knight takes d5, ed. When white plays the natural move d4 and black plays his knight out to c6, What black players really dream about is white capturing this pawn on d5 after the moves dc, bishop takes c5, queen takes d5. In theory, black is not supposed to have enough compensation for his pawn, but in practice the move queen b6 is very difficult to meet, as it makes threats against this pawn on f2. I think that this position is likely to favour the player who's better prepared, and probably it will be black. Instead of getting embroiled in this line, I recommend that you play dc, and after bishop takes c5, the calm developing move bishop out to d3. If black now castles kingside, you can unleash bishop takes h7 check, and after king takes h7, go knight g5 check. King g8 gives white a winning attack after queen h5, threatening queen h7 mate and meeting rook e8 with queen takes f7 check. Even if black doesn't fall for bishop takes h7 check, I think that white's got a better position here, due mainly to the weaknesses in black's pawn structure. These pawns on d5 and d7 certainly aren't a pretty sight. If black on his third move plays d6, white should go d4, and after cd, play queen takes d4, which once again accentuates the fact that white's got superior development. If black plays knight c6, then bishop b5 will lead to positions we looked at earlier. After bishop d7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now bishop g5 by white, followed by castling queenside. If instead of knight c6, black first plays the tricky a6, hoping to stop any pin with bishop b5, white can outsmart his opponent with the idea queen back to d3, intending to build up on this weak d6 pawn with bishop f4 and probably castles queenside. This line shows one of the advantages of not having this knight on d4, and that now white can build up pressure on the d-file at his leisure. Black may think he's being clever if he plays a6 in this position, still waiting for white to play d4 and stopping your bishop coming out to b5. However, white can now switch plans completely and head for a structure in which this a6 move is really not very useful at all. By going g3, white heads for a closed build-up, and after, for example, knight c6, bishop g2, d6, white can castle and meet knight f6 with the restrained move d3. White's plan in this position is to keep the centre stable and gradually trundle forward on the king side with his pawns. A good way of doing this would be to go h3 followed by knight h2 and f4, and eventually even moves like g4 will become possible. One of the problems that black has in this position is that his pieces aren't really actively placed enough to be able to get counterplay, and he might easily come under a very strong attack from white's kingside pawn storm. After knight f3, Najdorf and Dragon players would play the move d6, but then knight c3 gives them a problem. After the automatic knight f6, white can play a move e5, which was championed by the great Estonian grandmaster Paul Keres and is quite dangerous for black. After d takes e5, knight takes e5, black is suddenly in danger from things like bishop b5 check, or just quick development based on d4. Most black players, when facing this line for the first time, will probably choose something solid like e6, hoping to get their king castled. After bishop e2, they probably go bishop e7, and after castles by white, do the same thing. This position may seem okay for black, but after bishop f3, I think he's got long-term problems with the development of his queenside, mainly because he can't bring the knight out to the natural c6 square. In a game between Keres and Ree, played in Beverwijk 1969, black tried to solve the problem with this queen's knight by bringing it to d7 and hoping that white would exchange off his powerful knight on e5. Keres, however, dropped the knight back to another good square on c4. Black continued his policy of trying to exchange pieces with knight b6, but then Keres dropped this knight back to e3 and left black still with his queenside problems to solve, notably this b7 pawn and the badly placed knight on b6. If black were to play knight on b to d5, then white would inflict a weak pawn on his opponent, with knight takes d5, and after knight takes d5, capture once again, and when black plays ed, white can go d4, targeting this d5 pawn for attack. This explains why black retraced his steps with knight back to d7, but now white exploited the fact that black had been losing time to open the game up, and he went d4. After cd, queen takes d4, white was better placed because his pieces are more active, and black still has this major problem about the b7 pawn, which keeps his bishop tied down to the c8 square. If instead of e6, black immediately sets about challenging this knight on e5 with knight bd7, the Russian player Vasyukov has been experimenting with d4, which involves white in a pawn sacrifice in the endgame after knight takes e5, de, queen takes d1 check, king takes d1, knight g4. Vasyukov has been playing bishop b5 check with success, and after king d8, he actually plays king e2, getting ready to bring his rook over to the d-file. Instead of d4, white can also play in a much more simple way with knight c4, as in a game between the very nervous American grandmaster Walter Brown and Henrique Mecking, played in Mar del Plata in 1971. Mecking played e6, only to face the strong move d4, and after cd, queen takes d4, black was suddenly faced with this move knight d6 check, messing up his development. Mecking found no other way to meet this other than to ignore it with bishop c5, but after knight d6 check, king e7, knight takes c8 check, white got a position in which he's got two bishops and black's king is stuck in the centre. The great advantage of this Keres line with e5, de, knight takes e5 is that white can get a small advantage without being embroiled in all the Najdorf and dragon theory. A typical mistake for black, for example, is to go a6, after which a4 sets up the possibility of crippling black's queenside pawns at a later date with the move a5. This is just the kind of positional mistake black may come up with once he's thrown onto his own resources. In order to avoid this knight f6, e5 line, some educated Najdorf players may try to be clever by going a6. Yet once again, I don't think that a6 is a very useful move if white now opts for a closed Sicilian formation by going g3. If black plays b5, white can go bishop g2, and after bishop b7, threatening this pawn on e4, white can just calmly protect it with d3. A game between Meking and Ljubojevic, played in Vršac in Yugoslavia in 1971, continued with the move g6, after which white castled kingside. And then on bishop g7, Meking got ready to launch a kingside attack with knight h4. The point of this move is to make way for the f-pawn, and white intends to go f2 to f4 to f5, with strong kingside pressure. Meking won this game in 34 moves. Going back to the position after white's g3, black played knight out to c6 in a game between Bayasis and Timan in Vaikanze 1980. Bayasis played bishop g2, and now Timan started to try and fight for the d4 and e5 squares by going bishop out to g4. White replied with h3, and after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, Timan fianchettoed his king's bishop with g6. This all seemed very nice until Bayasis played his next move, which was the stunning e5. If black takes this pawn with his knight, there follows queen takes b7, threatening the rook on a8. And if this rook goes to b8, white can simply take another pawn with queen takes a6. Black actually decided to take on e5 with the pawn, but then he was knocked back with a move queen takes c6 check. And after bc, bishop takes c6 check, forced black to give back the queen with queen d7. White continued, of course, with bishop takes d7 check, and after king takes d7, he set about attacking black's weak pawns with knight a4. This position is very unpleasant for black. He has no compensation whatsoever for his pawn weaknesses, and went on to lose the game. Dragon players, who might try and avoid knight f6, e5, could well come up with the move 3g6, but this in my opinion is a serious mistake. After white's d4, black takes it, and now white captures with the queen, hitting this rook on h8. If black now plays his knight out to f6, there follows e5. And if knight comes out to c6, hitting the queen, white can pin it with bishop out to b5. This transposes into a position we looked at earlier, in which black got a really miserable endgame after d takes e5, queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, and now bishop takes c6, bc, knight takes e5. The move queen takes d4 is so strong in fact that black was reduced to playing the miserable f6 in the game Keres-Bilek, Moscow 1967. I think you'll agree that black's position is not a pretty sight. Two of black's alternatives at this point transpose into positions we've already looked at. Knight c6 can be met by bishop out to b5, and if black plays e5, white as usual posts his bishop on this effective diagonal, bishop c4. Finally, we come to some rare second moves for black, including the O'Kelly variation with a6, the hyper-accelerated dragon with g6, and the Nimzowitsch variation with knight f6. After knight f6, you should of course attack the knight with e5, and then after knight d5, white plays for quick development by bringing his knight out to c3. The move e6 leads to positions we've already looked at after knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now d4, in which I recommended that after knight c6, dc, bishop takes c5, White rejects the tempting offer of this pawn on d5 and instead continue fast development with bishop out to d3. Occasionally black has captured this knight on c3, but then white plays once more for fast development with d takes c3. White will follow this up by going bishop c4, bishop f4, queen e2 and castling queenside, and black really hasn't been able to come up with an effective way of dealing with this plan. If black plays g6, I recommend that once again you use this thrust of the h-pawn with h4, after which h5 is going to be very annoying for black. You can take it from a confirmed 2g6 Sicilian player that this h4 move is very difficult to meet. Last but not least, we come to the O'Kelly variation with 2a6, which Andrew Martin recommended in one of his secret weapons videos. This move a6 is quite useful in many Sicilian lines, but not against the delayed wing gambit with b4. After cb, d4, white gets a huge centre and very fast development. The wing gambit is much more dangerous for black than is commonly believed, and here, with what amounts to virtually an extra tempo after black's a6, it has to be good. The lines I've shown you will throw a spanner into the works of your opponent's favourite Sicilian schemes and take them into new and dangerous territory. Death to the Sicilian! Long live 1e4!